Hello, everyone. Welcome to our monthly webinar series of the IDEA Early Career Researchers Talk. I am Anshanaka, hosting this monthly webinar that brings early career researchers together for a depth conversation about our work. I am a postdoctoral fellow based at Queen's University, researching on disability inclusive mentorship. My research interest aims to improve the long-term health and work outcomes of persons with disability and injured and sick workers with acquired disability through holistic approach. Thank you for joining us today. Our today's session is uniquely set up by involving two speakers, at the same time co-presenters. Thank you, Ashvene and Jillian. Our speakers will share us about their work titled Psychological Therapies for Multiple Sclerosis, Moving Towards Best Practices. Please allow me to briefly introduce you our co-presenters. Ashvene is a PhD candidate at Queen's University, at the University of Toronto within Rehabilitation Science Institute and a research associate within IDEA. Ashvene holds a Bachelor of Science in Health Science and a Master's in Health and Rehabilitation Science from Western University. She is a mixed method researcher with a focus on equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and health service research. Particularly, her PhD work involves the development of an implementation toolkit to support the development of online mindfulness-based interventions for people living with MS. Also, our co-presenter, Jillian, is a PhD candidate in rehabilitation science at the University of Toronto. She holds MSc in kinesiology and health sciences from Queen's University and a BSc in kinesiology from McMaster University. Her doctoral research focuses on informing the development of a toolkit to support healthcare providers in prescribing physical activity for people living with MS. Jillian's research interests focus on promotion and implementation of health behavior initiatives to improve the well-being of people living with MS. Ashvene and Jillian will share the stage to talk about their groundbreaking research that involves findings from large meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. Their presentation will highlight which psychological therapies are most effective and what components drive better outcomes for MS patients. They will also discuss about ADI in MS research and practical recommendations to improve access to psychological support for within work contexts, hopefully facilitating to our thoughts to connect this knowledge for workers living with MS. I will leave the stage for our presenters, but before that, some housekeeping for all of us. After our speakers talk, we will move into Q&A session. I hope to receive questions from audiences as the presentation run. You can forward them using the Q&A function. Ashvene and Jillian, thank you for joining us to speak in today's series. The floor is open for you.
Thank you so much for having us. So like she said, my name is Jillian, and I'm a PhD candidate at Rehabilitation Sciences Institute at the University of Toronto, and I'll be presenting with my lab mate, Ashvene, who is also supervised by Dr. Robert Simpson and Dr. Sarah Muntz at Rehabilitation Sciences Institute. And I just want to give a quick thank you to the rest of our team members who helped us with this study, who we would not be here today without their support. So just want to give a quick thanks, and their names are on the slide there. So we're going to be talking about our project, Psychological Therapies for People with Multiple Sclerosis, Moving Towards Best Practices. So just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to start by giving a bit of a background about multiple sclerosis and the work that our team has been doing. Then I'll be going into the network meta-analysis that we conducted, which looked at which psychological therapies are effective for people with MS and which are most effective. Then I'll be talking about our mediator-moderator analyses, which essentially looks at what drives or hinders beneficial outcomes that we've seen in these studies. Then I'll pass it off to Ashvene, who will go through our meta-regression findings, looking at intervention componentry and context and how this may influence our outcomes, our EDIA analysis, and then the implications of this work. So, multiple sclerosis is a chronic, disabling, demyelinating neurodegenerative condition that affects the central nervous system. According to the NIH, it is the most disabling neurological condition of young adults. Currently, over 90,000 Canadians have multiple sclerosis, with Canada having one of the highest prevalences, if not the highest prevalence, of MS worldwide. People with MS experience a wide range of distressing symptoms, with fatigue being the most common and rated as the most disabling. In addition to these symptoms, people with MS are often multimorbid and experience a range of comorbidity, including elevated depression and anxiety. People with MS are approximately 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with a mood disorder compared to the general population. Although these high levels occur, there are limited treatment options to manage these conditions for people with MS. Medications are often poorly tolerated in this population, and non-pharmacological interventions should be considered but are often unavailable. In addition to troubling symptoms and comorbidities, people living with MS may experience other social impacts. So, one such area is unemployment. Approximately 48% of people with MS living in Canada noted unemployment due to complexities of disease progression. These factors may include things such as pain, fatigue, cognitive impairment, and disease severity. Now, unemployment in people with MS has a series of challenges with negative impacts previously reported, including heightened stress, anxiety, and depression due to financial insecurity from unemployment or from part-time employment. It also has impacts on lack of routine or loss of routine that was previously there, and a diminished perception of self-worth. So, of note, the most significant predictor of absenteeism of employed people with MS is fatigue. Just keep this in mind as we talk a little bit later about some of our findings. So, people with MS often experience multiple health inequities, including access to specialists, MS, and mental health care. As noted before, medications are poorly tolerated in this population, so access to non-pharmacological interventions is needed. So, one such manner of looking for improvements in care is through the creation of clinical guidelines, which have been shown to improve quality of and access to care. It's important for guidelines to exist for clinicians to know how best to treat people with multiple sclerosis in care, and for decision makers to be able to say, this is what will work best and should be supported in this population. So, MS Best synthesizes literature to guide best practices and evidence for effectiveness of various interventions in people with MS. So, one such focus was on psychological therapies, as they wanted to consider whether these may provide an effective non-pharmacological intervention for people with MS. Thus, we conducted a literature review to make recommendations on whether psychological therapies may improve various outcomes in people with MS in a way that is informed by best practices. So our study used a network meta-analysis design. I'll just give a bit of a background on that now. So this type of analysis synthesizes studies in the area and provides valuable information as to which interventions, which in our case would be psychological therapies, have been compared before in previous studies. This lets researchers know what types of interventions still need to be studied and compared. You can see from the image on the right an output from our network meta-analysis, the types of studies compared, with larger bubbles representing more studies examining those interventions, and the lines representing comparisons between the types of interventions, with thicker lines representing more studies comparing these interventions. Additionally, a network meta-analysis compares different types of interventions against each other directly. The analysis also ranks interventions for effectiveness, providing an understanding as to which type of psychological therapy shows the strongest effect compared to the others. So with this in mind, we used a network meta-analysis approach to evaluate the effectiveness of psychological therapies in people with MS. We considered best evidence by only examining randomized controlled trials comparing psychological therapies to a control or other psychological therapy. This was chosen to provide valuable information as to which psychological therapies are effective and should be prioritized in care, and also which are understudied. So we worked with an academic librarian to search various academic and scientific databases of articles and identified approximately 7,000 studies. After screening for eligibility, 111 studies were included in our review, providing information on the types of populations, interventions, and methods used. 89 studies had enough data that they were included in individual meta-analyses, which will be described shortly, and 77 studies had adequate data to be included in the network meta-analysis. So this study included data from 3,911 participants, highlighting the broad scope and strength of this work. So on the screen, you can see a ranking of all therapies, which is an output from the network meta-analysis on improvements on overall outcomes. If you look on the right, you can see different types of psychological therapies in a ranking. This shows that cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, was the most effective therapy in improving outcomes overall when compared to other psychological therapies. It also shows that all of the therapies showed improvements when compared to the control condition, which is seen at the bottom there. So we also conducted a series of individual meta-analyses for people with doing psychological therapies on 4 different categories of outcomes. We looked at quality of life, cognition, physical health, which includes things such as fatigue, pain, sleep, amongst others, and mental health. So these analyses combined data across studies to examine the standard mean differences across interventions. What we found is that psychological therapies significantly improved all 4 areas, meaning we found improvements in overall quality of life, cognition, physical health, and mental health. Out of these categories, psychological therapies had the greatest improvement in mental health outcomes. When we looked at anxiety and depression on their own, we also found significant improvements in each of these measures. So, although our analysis examined high quality evidence across a large number of studies, this analysis was not without limitations. Several studies did not report data, especially when it came to reporting information about their participants or the interventions themselves. In those that did report this data, multiple studies reported this data poorly in a way that made it difficult or impossible in some cases for us to include them in our analyses. Further, our analysis suggests that very few studies, only about 10%, engaged a statistician in their analyses, which presents concerns regarding data accuracy. Finally, there were a few studies that reported findings that were more than 4 times greater than typically reported effect sizes for psychological intervention studies. In these cases, studies were not included in the individual meta-analyses nor the network meta-analysis out of concerns of accuracy and data skewing. So all of this asks the question, what should be included when reporting a randomized controlled trial in this field? So when considering what studies should be doing, there should be a clearly defined PICO, or population intervention comparison and outcome. This means that ahead of the study, it is important to clearly define who your target population is, what your eligibility criteria are, and to not deviate from this. In terms of intervention, this should be a well-defined intervention and use this intervention consistently throughout. There should be a clear comparator group throughout, and there should be a priori decisions on what the outcome measures will be and how these will be measured and at what time points as well. In some of the studies that we looked at, this was not clearly defined or it changed partway through. Next, what we call our table 1 information that's important. So it is important that studies are able to accurately describe who is actually in their studies, because it's important then for us to be able to understand which populations have been understudied, and also how does this affect generalizability? If we are looking at a study that is only done in women with a specific phenotype of MS, does this apply to other populations? So what is important going forward is that there is not only the collection of, but also the reporting of key demographic information such as sex, age, education, race, socioeconomic status, and others found in the Progress Plus framework, but also this information collected on disease-related covariates such as severity scores, which in MS is typically monitored through something called the EDSS, and also relevant comorbid conditions like mental health diagnosis, especially in psychological therapies. Next, in terms of results, some of the studies that we looked at did not report results in a way that we could use them, as I noted. So it's important that our CTs give information on the baseline values for both your intervention and your comparator group, and also explain how many people were reporting on these outcomes. It's also important that they give follow-up values for all of these, along with a change score and standard deviation for each arm and the effect size and treatment effect. These are sort of the minimum requirements that a statistician would need to be able to do a meta-analysis going forward. Um, so in summary, please follow the consort checklist when doing all of these. And our last point here is added by our team's lovely statistician that when in doubt, please ask a statistician. They can help provide really strong guidance and ensure that the work that you're doing is being done in a way that is reproducible and also completely accurate to the data that you've collected. So next slide, please, Ash. So in addition to our network meta-analysis, we conducted mediation analyses to examine whether any of the variables we collected were mediators between psychological therapies and our outcomes. As noted, the aim was to examine which variables influence the relationship between psychological therapy and a wide range of outcomes. So the only variable that was found to be a significant mediator of this relationship was fatigue, where an intervention that addresses fatigue could improve overall outcomes. This is especially important for us to consider in this talk. As I mentioned before, fatigue was found to be the most significant predictor of work absenteeism in employed people with MS. Further, we examined interactions or moderating effects, which is an interaction occurs when the presence of a demographic variable affects the relationship between the exposure and the outcome. We considered sex, age, MS phenotype, severity of MS, level of education, employment status, and we tried to also include some other ones such as race and ethnicity. However, these were not reported often and could not be studied in the same way. So when considering each of these variables, we found that level of education, specifically studies with greater numbers of university graduates as participants, was found to exert a moderate, positive, significant interaction effect on outcome measures. So this suggests that studies who included participants with higher levels of educations tended to report better findings following their psychological therapy than those without. So while we have these findings, again, it is important to consider that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Simply put, even though we only found fatigue and education to be significant mediators and moderators, it may be due to the lack of other variables available. So most candidate variables, as I mentioned, were not well reported by most studies and could not be investigated or insufficient to be able to draw any valid conclusions. In the future, more studies will need to measure and report these variables in order to evaluate their possible mediating or interacting effects on psychotherapies in the MS population. So I'm now going to pass off to Ashvene to discuss additional analyses we conducted.
Great. Thank you so much, Jill. So now that we know that psychological therapies are effective for people with MS, the next question really becomes what specific aspects of these interventions actually drive better outcomes? So it's not just whether psychological therapies works, it's how it's delivered. For example, does session length matter? Does who delivers the intervention matter? Does tailoring the content to MS make a difference? Understanding intervention componentry also allows us to better tailor these therapies, maximize benefits, and ultimately improve health outcomes and quality of life for people with MS. So in order to examine this, we conducted a meta-regression, which in this case is used to investigate the causes of heterogeneity or variation in findings across studies within a meta-analysis. So in this case, we explored how study characteristics and intervention componentry influenced outcome effects. So, from the included studies in the review, about 34% reported enough detail to be included in this analysis. So, while we initially identified 33 potential intervention variables, due to inconsistent reporting and weak or unstable effects, only 4 were retained in the final model. And these were study quality, mode of delivery, intervention provider, and tailoring to the MS population. So, our analysis showed that therapies were more effective when they were delivered in person or online, were led by a licensed psychologist, were tailored specifically to people with MS. So, this includes, for example, shortening session lengths or incorporating MS related content into the intervention and materials. So, in contrast, interventions that were not tailored were delivered by phone or used a hybrid online and person format tended to be less effective. So, similar to the other analysis we conducted, there are some important limitations to note. So, first is that intervention characteristics were poorly reported and inconsistently reported. So, for example, we couldn't analyze whether individual versus group therapy made a difference because that information wasn't consistently described. Second, many studies had to be excluded due to insufficient data. So while our findings provide some direction, they're based on a subset of trials that reported enough information. So this really highlights a major reporting gap in the field, and it provides important guidance for future research in this space. So next, I'll be speaking to our equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility analysis that we conducted. So while MS has historically been reported as more prevalent in white populations, prevalence is increasing amongst individuals from minority ethnic backgrounds. At the same time, people with MS face systemic barriers to accessing mental health services, and this includes things like geographic isolation, stigma, and financial barriers as well. Systemic barriers can also widen existing healthcare disparities, which are often not experienced in isolation. So these barriers can contribute to challenges in accessing mental health services, and people with MS often report a lot of difficulty in accessing these services, and they feel that mental health is an overlooked part of their overall care. Research related to systemic inequities in these types of interventions, though, is very limited. So, to better understand these disparities, it's really important that we apply an intersectional lens. Intersectionality can help us understand how different social determinants of health, like gender, age, education, interact to create experiences of discrimination and privilege. So, let's take a look at a quick case example. Think of an older man who is in his late 60s living in a rural community where access to specialized healthcare services can be limited. He has a high school level education and worked in a physically demanding job until his MS symptoms made continued employment extremely challenging due to the physically demanding nature of the tasks required at his job. He also lives with a cognitive impairment that affects his memory. These factors, combined with his age, have contributed to healthcare providers overlooking his psychological needs. So, for example, there may be a gendered assumption that older men are less likely to seek mental health support, and this can influence referral patterns, for example, through his primary care provider to an online mindfulness-based intervention. So, taken together, these barriers create compounding disadvantages that make it significantly harder for him to access psychological interventions that are tailored to his unique needs. So this leads us to the objective of this particular analysis, which was focused on investigating how EDIA characteristics are specifically reported within these randomized control trials. So who is actually being included in the studies and who is being left out of the evidence base? And would these interventions still be applicable and accessible to marginalized groups of people with MS? So this study, like I mentioned, was a secondary analysis of our larger systematic review and network meta-analysis. And EDIA variables that we extracted on were guided by the Progress Plus framework, which accounts for factors such as socioeconomic status, age, place of residence, education, and employment. Prevalence ratios were calculated using mean reported values from included studies compared to population norms. And we also did a Bayesian analysis using informative priors to assess bias in reported effect sizes. The Bayesian analysis is really interesting because it lets you update your beliefs as new evidence comes in, which mirrors how, humans, how we naturally think and how we learn. So instead of just testing whether the data is surprising or not, it tells you the probability that a hypothesis is true given the data. It's intuitive and it's especially powerful when data can be limited or uncertain, or if there's a lot of heterogeneity, which is characteristic of this network meta-analysis. So let's take a look at who was actually included across these RCTs. So out of the included studies, participants were predominantly younger, white, had lower levels of disability, had an undergraduate degree or higher, and were more likely to be employed full-time. Individuals experiencing risk factors such as unemployment and lower education were not adequately included in these studies. For reporting characteristics, age of participants was pretty consistently reported in over 60% of the included studies, while other factors such as race, ethnicity, comorbidities, and socioeconomic status were reported in less than 20%. So social determinants of health can be a really important aspect of someone's identity, and it can also impact how they experience an intervention. So in this case, a psychological therapy. So a key part of the story is ultimately missing when these factors are not reported on. Another interesting finding related to exclusion criteria was that participants were primarily excluded from these trials based on age, so advanced age over 60, cognitive impairment, and severe psychiatric disorders. Evidence actually shows that psychological interventions can improve cognition and help support psychiatric disorders when there's flexibility of the intervention in mind. And so exclusion based off these characteristics alone would need robust justifications. And this is where the Bayesian reanalysis comes in. So the Bayesian analysis with informative priors to assess bias in the demographic characteristics showed evidence of bias in the effect estimates of key variables, and most notably related to age, expanded disability status scale, or EDSS, and employment scores. So this suggests that previous findings as part of these studies may be less substantial than initially believed. So as such, the shift in estimates indicates that the exclusion of older people with MS above 50 or those with higher EDSS scores lacks justification. Studies that disproportionately recruited younger participants or those with lower levels of disability produced estimates of the intervention. So, for example, related to effectiveness or impact on mental health outcomes that were unlikely to actually generalize to broader groups of people with MS. The findings of the Bayesian analysis are of methodological importance specifically because it highlights that exclusion criteria and recruitment practices actively shape the evidence base. So the inflation of perceived effectiveness of the intervention involved including participants who were actually more likely to engage with the intervention, adhere to the intervention, and ultimately benefit. So this highlights the need for more inclusive recruitment practices to improve the applicability of findings to broader groups who have diverse social determinants of health. So our findings showed that many psychological interventions may not have actually been rigorously evaluated in diverse groups of people with MS. It's important that future research accounts for social determinants of health and intersectionality at the outset, integrated into all parts of the research process. So one of these ways could be through something we do called an integrated knowledge translation approach, where we convene a panel, for example, with people with lived experience, clinicians, instructors, policy influencers, in order to inform relevancy of the study, but also account for diversity and intersectionality at the outset. Future research should also strive to use more inclusive recruitment practices and broaden eligibility criteria to reflect diverse lived experiences. Inclusive trial design contributes to person-centered care, particularly for historically overlooked populations. And in this case specifically, like I mentioned before, MS diagnosis is becoming more prevalent in minority ethnic populations. And so it's really important that we understand how this fits into current recruitment practices in these large-scale RCT studies. These improvements in trial design can enhance implementation efforts. So when we're looking at sustainability, for example, and inform the development of mental health interventions that are responsive to the actual broader needs of the MS community, and not just individuals who are the most study ready. Diverse groups of people with MS must be involved in order to develop interventions that are accessible, culturally responsive, and inclusive. So there were some limitations in our EDIA analysis as well, particularly in the poor reporting of race and ethnicity, which limited our ability to do a deeper analysis. There was also little standardization in how demographic variables were defined. So there were different studies who approached the demographic characteristics differently, either defined it differently, or didn't mention a definition. And there was a lack of guiding frameworks that were used and integrated as well. So one of the options is the Progress Plus framework, but other frameworks do exist, like the intersectionality flower, which can help guide demographic characteristic reporting and integration within these RCTs. So again, this reinforces the need for improved reporting standards overall. So now I want to bring together our findings and place them in the context of implications for workplace disability inclusion. So our first analysis was the main network meta-analysis that Jill spoke about. And this showed that psychological therapies have the greatest impact on mental health outcomes. So this has implications for building workplace mental health supports as well as disability management programs. And it shows that supporting psychological well-being may reduce secondary workplace consequences such as absenteeism. There's also a need for future research in this space. So our mediator-moderator analysis showed that reducing fatigue positively mediates outcomes. And fatigue, as Jill mentioned, is one of the strongest predictors of workplace absenteeism in people with MS. In terms of guidance, in terms of our intervention componentry analysis, these findings offer guidance related to building psychological therapy support, so related to online or in-person delivery, involving licensed psychologists, and focusing on how to tailor the content. These findings can inform workplace benefits design as well as mental health programming, but we do need more research in this space to examine implementation more specifically within the workplace context. Through our EDIA analysis, there's a clear need for more research exploring people with MS who are underrepresented in these RCTs. And part of that is understanding the complexities related to work. So, like I mentioned before, there is an overestimate of people who were included who were employed full time. And so it's important to look at people with different types of employment experiences. So casual, part-time, unemployed, return to work. In order to be more inclusive across the RCTs. So bringing it all together, it's important to recognize that MS isn't just a neurological condition, it's a psychological journey that unfolds over time because it's a chronic disease. And diagnosis is typically in people quite young, so the chronic management piece is extremely important. So, at diagnosis, people with MS are often adjusting to a new reality, searching for information, and in need of meaningful support. During relapse, there can be stressful life events and reduced self-efficacy, which can worsen symptoms and coping. In terms of progression, many experience identity redefinition and the complex process of acceptance. And it can be an iterative process, so it can require kind of going back in steps and understanding the diagnosis, management, and sustainability piece as well. Psychological therapies can support people at each of these stages, often strengthening coping, building self-efficacy, reducing distress, and helping individuals integrate MS into their understanding and sense of self. Addressing the psychological dimension is a key tenet for approaching this type of care from a holistic perspective. So, another interesting piece is how people with MS tend to describe stress. People often describe stress as a poison, and it's often associated with a host of symptoms, including cognitive, fatigue, spasticity, pain, and sleep disturbances. And so, when we're able to target stress through these psychological interventions, we may be influencing both mental and physical symptom burden, which is why it's really important to understand how these interventions can be built with a broader scope of the MS community in mind, while addressing the diversity of social determinants of health and intersectionality. So, what are some of our pragmatic recommendations from this work? The first is that psychological therapies are effective across outcome domains and should be widely available to people with MS. And the second is that psychological therapy should prioritize the treatment of fatigue because management can have positive impacts on mental health outcomes. There's also a clear range of psychological therapies that are effective. Cognitive behavioral therapy, in particular, was found to be effective as part of our work. And we can and should counsel people with MS in terms of understanding which may be the most effective and to provide options or a range of options. This also involves prioritizing access to trained therapists familiar with MS who can tailor the content accordingly. And in some of our other work that Jill and I have been a part of, this is a real clear need that people with MS report, which is that tailoring piece in order to account for diverse needs. It's also important that future trials be more inclusive and culturally responsive. In order to focus on the sustainability piece, we may need stepped care models and broader rehabilitation clinician training specifically. So here's some of our concurrent work in this space as Jill and I both work on our PhDs. My work in particular looks at, so it's a mixed methods project focused on implementation considerations of online mindfulness programs for people with MS. So I really look from an implementation science lens, as well as focusing on that EDIA piece to figure out how we can build more sustainable interventions over time. And that includes work, like I mentioned, with the integrated knowledge translation panel involving multiple different knowledge user groups, and having them involved from study conception all the way through dissemination. Jill is working on developing a toolkit as well to support healthcare providers in the prescription of physical activity for people with MS. If you're interested in learning more about our work, we did publish the findings of our main network meta-analysis. If you scan the QR code, you will be able to access that publication. We're also building the network of Canadian MS rehab knowledge mobilization, so please feel free to share your interests with our lead, Dr. Sarah Donkers, whose email is listed here. As well, stay tuned for more publications from this work that we reported on today, specifically in the International Journal of MS Care for the mediator moderator analysis and intervention componentry, and then the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology for the EDIA analysis. So these should be out shortly. We're working on some reviewer responses now, so they should be published within the next month or so. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for listening to our talk. And we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jillian and Ashvene. Thank you all for joining us today. That was groundbreaking presentation. I really learned a lot from this presentation and throughout our conversation as well in our previous communications. So the floor is open for the audiences, but I'm not, there's no any question on the Q&A. While we wait for any question from audiences, please forward using Q&A, or maybe we can open the chat if that is easy for audiences to forward their question. If not, I will have some questions to just warm up the stage so we can stay on the active conversation. So MS is often, honestly, about this presentation, I am so impressed with your work, and it's really fundamental, as MS is often lack recognition to be conceptualized within the work context. That can fuel a lot of psychological challenges for people living with MS. So raising this as a research agenda, and will create a conversation in the research ecosystem and with healthcare providers, so that there is a real need to consider the role of employment in their recovery, and also in a future quality of life for people who are affected by the MS. You effectively delivered and unpacked this topic. Thank you for that. So just forward one question. You mentioned that considering inclusive employment strategy is one of the recommendations that you forwarded. So what kind of practical recruitment strategy would you recommend for future trials to improve inclusivity in the research work? One of you can mention, or you can just take the stage. You can take your own turn.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Ansha, for the question. I can start off, and Jill, feel free to jump in whenever. So one of the things that I think is so important is that eligibility piece. So one of the things we uncovered was that a lot of the exclusion criteria that's part of these trials are not really justified. So I think in the future it would be really important to broaden eligibility criteria as justified. So incorporating people with different types of employment experiences, age, comorbidities, disability severity. I also think one of the most important things we've been finding is how we can connect with community organizations and partner organizations in order to reach groups who may not actively participate in these types of studies, because the trust building piece is so important. So with the community organizations, they often have networks established, trust established with their members, who share common vision and goals. And so being able to partner with these organizations, being able to leverage your research, communicate properly, and partner with these organizations, I think would be one of the more important recruitment strategies. Recruiting beyond just kind of specialty clinics, so not just MS clinics in urban areas, but trying to reach to rural groups. There is a Canadian network of MS clinics that has been built that includes clinics in rural areas, so that's one option. But there are not as many clinics in rural areas as urban areas. Also, providing flexibility of participation formats would be important. So, including asynchronous options, even providing compensation for this work. So, one of the barriers to participating in RCTs or participating in even psychological therapies for people with MS is transportation. And so being able to provide compensation for that or transportation support can be important. But from the employment perspective, I think being able to reach people throughout all different types of employment journeys would be important. And that's where we can talk with community partners, even organizations, of course, such as IDEA, who would have these established networks. And so being able to speak with them would be really important. And using a combination of those. There was a study that was recently published that said a lot of these times RCTs tend to use only one type of recruitment strategy, which can be very limiting for the types of people involved. And so being able to pull on multiple sources is very, very important, especially in this space. Jill, sorry, feel free to add anything to that.
No, that was perfect. I was just going to flag that there was a paper that came out in 2023, I believe, that was by Ruth Anne Marie and colleagues, and they had an international consortium of MS researchers where they got together to talk about more inclusive recruitment for MS research, and they put out a series of recommendations. So Ashvene covered most of them. I think a few other minor ones that they noted were having less strict less strict eligibility criteria. So as Ashvene said in her presentation, a lot of times the studies would say if you are above this age, you're not included, or if you have these symptoms, you're not included. And some of these might be related potentially to employment status, as we found. Um, Fatigue could be a driver of that, but also cognitive symptoms were often a driver of work absenteeism. So if you're doing these studies and that is an exclusion criteria, then it limits our understanding of being able to recruit from those populations and understand how that might be affected. So really trying to have more inclusive eligibility criteria was also a recommendation that they suggested. But I was just going to flag that paper in case people are interested. It was a good read on different ways to be involved like that.
Interesting. Interesting. Thank you. There are a couple of questions. One is just thank you and an excitement to read your work from publication. The question from Cheyenne. There are a couple of questions from Cheyenne. The first one is based on what you have discussed, the fatigue-mediated outcomes, and even Jillian, you were mentioning that now in your response, fatigue-mediated outcomes, and it seems that it is a major predictor of absenteeism. How might psychological therapies be integrated into workplace disability management system? I think if they have experience of this fatigue, they will be absent, and then how that psychological therapy would be a support for in the work context. You might address that first, and then we'll come to the second question.
Yeah, for sure. So fatigue is such a big piece, and it's not just characteristic of people with MS. It's a feature in a lot of different types of chronic conditions. I think it can play a really important role in like return to work programs, building that in to CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapies. I think that could be a real focus, especially as we support people in their return to work journeys. I also think offering them as online programs plays a really big role. So that's some of the work that I'm doing currently, is trying to build an implementation toolkit for how we can integrate these considerations for diverse groups of people with MS. And part of that can be within the employment context. So I think there's more research to be had there, especially through different types of employer-sponsored health benefits and the role that psychological therapies can play in that. So offering online programs, for example, can reduce some of the intensive resource burden that it takes to deliver these interventions. And that's something that we found in the intervention componentry analysis, was that online programs have such an important impact because it can help with things like fatigue, because you're not having to go in person and you can kind of take breaks as needed, sort of thing. So it can play a role in return to work programs, maybe through employer-sponsored health benefits, and also just in general of like stress reduction strategies integrated throughout in the workplace context, maybe through occupational health services. And the last thing I'll mention is in terms of like disability case managers, I think being able to recognize fatigue as a barrier is so important, and not just as, something physical, but psychological and physiological as well. It's not something that can be just fixed or managed. It's often something that you have to deal with in a chronic manner. So I think, providing some training on that, but having important discussions about what fatigue means and how that impacts and interacts with stress. And then again, in the context of people with MS, but also people living with chronic conditions, I think can be so important.
Jillian, do you have anything, or we can proceed to the next question? If you want, you can add.
Just a very brief one with that, as well as I think the question as well is how might it be integrated? And sort of next step to study is how do we convince people of that too, right? And that you need those decision makers to come on board. So that's why I'd introduced a little bit at the beginning of the reason that MS Best does some of this work is to give that sort of first evidence piece and develop those guidelines so that you can go to a group and say, here is best practices, or how could we then look at making this part of a workplace disability management program. But that's sort of future steps and work that can be done about how do we actually translate this into outcomes and how do we work with the decision makers in those areas.
And I will add a shameless plug here for our research on that, because we did talk to decision makers and people in kind of authoritative positions on how we can convince them to implement this work. And honestly, it comes down to funding most of the time. What can we bring to you in order to convince you to fund this important work, and also to make it accessible to everyone so they're not having to pay out of pocket, because some of the times it's not really covered by insurance. So we did publish our findings just on what we found, and a lot of it, the policymakers said, you have to convince us in an emotional way. You have to come to us with a story. You need to be able to convince us, really tap into that emotional piece, because if we're not connected to your story, we're not going to be convinced that it's important. So yeah, just a shameless plug there. But our findings on that were really interesting.
Interesting, really interesting. Calls for more qualitative research as well to tell the story what behind these all processes. And the next question was also my thought actually. I was just trying to prepare that kind of question, and thank you. They have forwarded this. The question is, I would like to have your thoughts about immigrants with MS and how therapies can be varied for them based on your different their cultural contexts. You have mentioned that often MS is considered to be a health condition that mostly affects people in the northern hemisphere and white people. But in your finding, you mentioned that MS prevalence is rising among this diverse population. And in my recent research, it's with a different population about the return to work of injury survivors actually that I did. And within that context, for people who are affected by different health conditions, for different multicultural workforces, we might need to consider different perspectives, values, cultural backgrounds, and we need to move more to understand personalized values that might affect their health condition and their work engagement. So looking into this, considering Canada is a multicultural country, Canadian workforce is multicultural, we have a diverse work population. So how do you conceptualize that the needs and access to psychological therapies for MS, for people who are affected by MS, like this diverse population affected by MS, like it can reflect based on your finding, or what do you recommend for future research as well?
Yeah, that's such a great question. That's part of the reason that we undertook the EDIA analysis, is because we had a feeling that it was underreported, not very well described, and our part of our questioning was, well, if rates are rising within minority ethnic populations, they need to be included in these trials for us to understand how to best deliver these interventions in an acceptable format where they're able to engage and benefit from these interventions. So that's part of the future directions of this work, but we've been conducting that work in other areas. So with my own work with the online mindfulness specifically, part of understanding how to best deliver these interventions, for example, to immigrants, is having them on the integrated knowledge translation panel. So being able to inform our research questions, but also get their perspectives on the different types of questions we ask, considerations for the toolkit. For example, we in the survey that we did, we asked about what type of accessibility considerations are most meaningful. Should it be offered in different language formats? And what type of examples do you want to see embedded within the content? So one of our interview participants from the qualitative work mentioned that they weren't resonating with the psychological therapies provided because the context wasn't relevant to them. Like within the examples, they were describing scenarios where they really weren't able to relate to it based on the cultural context that they come from. So they said they began to lose interest and weren't really able to engage in the same way. So I think building in culturally relevant examples would be so important, perhaps providing them in different language formats. But I think we also need to take a step back and interview and get data on how people engage with in the space, engage with mental health as a whole, because there's often a lot of stigma associated with it, what resonates, what doesn't, and how they conceptualize their own mental health, and break down some of that stigma piece first. I think we should take a step back and see what it is that they want, and then figure out how to fit that in the psychological therapy context. And then the last thing I'll add is that we've also found that these populations tend to really value therapeutic relationships with their clinicians or healthcare providers. They really see them as like a guiding force, and they really see them as not an authoritative figure, but just someone who's very knowledgeable about these types of supports. So one of the things that we're working on is trying to train clinicians to be more culturally aware and understanding of these different types of psychological therapies available, so that since they're kind of in that position of having that therapeutic relationship with their patients, they should also be knowledgeable about the types of supports available. And so we're looking into some training pieces on that. But that's just part of my initial work, which is building that toolkit, partially for clinicians as well. So I hope that answers that question a little bit.
Interesting. Yes, yeah. You have really touch base all the important considerations that we need to understand. Fundamentally, I think there are many cultural and personal values that are embedded on a person that are affecting, triggering, or supporting the health conscience of the person. That's where we need to, when we suggest any psychological therapy for people who are experiencing absenteeism from work because of an illness, then there are personal meanings, there are personal values that could be tagged beyond those routine traditional therapy that literature suggests to support these people. So we need to deep dive into understanding the cultural and personal values that are attached to this health condition, so that we can design better psychological support for the diverse workforces. There is another question from Andrew that he has asked that whether there is a robust longitudinal data on CBT for persons with MS. If you would like to address this, then we can conclude today's webinar.
Yeah, so I can speak to that a bit. In terms of longitudinal, because our study only included RCTs, we didn't include any cohort studies or longitudinal ones. The follow-up, I would say, for most of these studies were usually pre-post and usually 3 or 6 months down the line. There were a couple that were 1 to 2 years down the line that showed effectiveness for CBT, but we didn't look into any that were looking like 10 years down the line or any sort of that far down. I can say as well, just from other qualitative work that we've done with psychological therapies for people with MS, um, even if we don't find quantitative differences, sometimes it will be described as a mindset shift that carries over time. So it'd be interesting to see if that is something that also holds over time. But yeah, longitudinally, just because of the types of studies that we included, that was sort of our max of what we were able to look to. I don't know if any exist. Ash, do you know of any, if there are any longitudinal ones?
No, just because it's kind of new in this space as
Yeah.
well. And that's why we're trying to do more implementation focused studies to understand sustainability, but also the impact of CBT over time. I will say one of the things that we've noted in some previous work is just that things like booster sessions and refresher sessions are especially important. And so that's another part of that like resource piece. We need to have the resources funding to be able to check in with patients as we go along. So hopefully some longitudinal data will come out, but for this particular systematic review, there weren't any, just based on the types of studies we included.
Thank you. Thank you, our speakers, Jillian and Ashvene. And thank you all the participants. It doesn't seem that we have few number, but it's really active and engaging. Thank you all for joining us today. And we are like time limits us to continue our conversation as well. Otherwise, let's continue our conversation, scholarly engagement to better understand how can we best support persons with different health conditions and with disabilities at the workplace, so we can improve the quality of life of all people in around us in the society. And thank you all. The feedback mechanism will be forwarded as a survey after this session. And also, you can also forward your feedback on the email to the IDEA National Office. If you are interested in our future early career researchers talk, learn more from IDEA website. However, we would like to announce our next early career researchers talk. Join us on the next one on March 11th at 12 p.m. by Janice Lam with a presentation topic of application enabling disclosing disability in job applications. So this is our next topic to discuss in the next session and on March 11th. Please join us. For those who are requesting, there are some few participants who are requesting a certificate of attendance. You can get this by emailing to the National Office of the IDEA. So please forward email to the IDEA National Office, then you will get a response from them. Thank you all, and let's continue to learn from each other and grow our community. And thank you. This is the end of our today's session.